Can I just welcome you to this webinar, Encounter, which is the third of a series of 3 where we're seeking to wrestle with some difficult themes. Our first 2 themes were remembering and memorial and grief and forgiveness. And if you missed them and you would like to catch up, then you can find them on our website, which is thriveIreland.org. Today, our theme is social and personal responsibility. Our overall title is Encounter, Victims, Survivors, and the Church. Thrive Ireland seeks to enable church and community transformation through a global lens. We've hosted 2 previous conferences, From Africa to Ireland and Speaking Out, and one of our speakers today, Bishop Magaya from Zimbabwe, joined us for the second of these, bringing not just refreshing insight into the church's vital role in advocacy against injustice, but models of excellent practice, which can be adapted for our context in Northern Ireland. We believe that a Christian vision of the common good is not just about the values of rights legislation, but also the virtues of human relationships in which meaningful encounter and vulnerable dialogue are possible. Hence the title of the series. Thrive Ireland's very name wants us to move towards a society and a community that can thrive and flourish, where we as individuals can have life and have it in all its fullness. When one of our speakers from the previous 2 webinars, Christophe Mboningabo from Rwanda, came to visit Northern Ireland to speak at our first conference, he also travelled to Lisnaskea to tell his story and to bring encouragement to members of the South East Fermanagh Foundation, SEFF. This began a relationship which has grown and developed both between Christophe, Thrive Ireland, and SEFF members. One of the aims of this series, Encounter, is to enable learning from the global context for all of us here in Northern Ireland. Sometimes it's hard to hear from someone local when we think we've heard it all before. But my experience in a number of African countries is that a different context helps to reframe an issue and challenge our cynicism. The second aim of the series is to create space to enable people to tell their stories and to be heard, for grief to be given a voice and for experiences to be validated, and for encounter to enable learning and understanding. The theologian Walter Brueggemann says, "There can be no healing from hurt without the public affirmation of the legitimacy of your story." And we believe that it is part of the church's role to facilitate space for this to happen. We would ask you as you listen to all of our speakers, to please use the Q&A button to ask questions. And Derek Poole, our facilitator today, will get through as many as we can in our time of discussion with the panel. You can also use it for comments and to support our speakers. Can I now introduce Kenny Donaldson, who is the Director of Services at the South East Fermanagh Foundation, who's partnering with us in these webinars. Thanks, Kenny.
Thank you, Diane, and it's a pleasure to be with everyone again today for our third and final part to this series. We've obviously had very challenging discussions thus far, useful discussions. I think a lot of thinking has been done between those weeks that we've begun this journey. But just a little first on SEFF, our organisation. Our roots are founded in Lisnaskea, South Fermanagh. We started in 1998 in the year of the Belfast Agreement, so we're in our 23rd year. And the group has always held a very consistent position on the issue of criminal violence, that in the context of our troubles, there was never justification for the use of violence in the furtherance of or defence of a political objective. We are an outwards facing organisation, as well as being national. We also have an international context and work with groupings in Spain, but also in more recent times through the good offices of Thrive Ireland, and we have managed to develop a relationship with Carsa Ministries and with Christophe. The subject of today's discussion, personal and societal responsibility, is something which is right at the heart of our work. And as we see a shrinking field, if I put it like that, in terms of the matter of justice and opportunities for justice recovery at this point for victims and survivors, never more has there been a need for this issue of acknowledgement within the context of responsibility to come to the fore. And from an organisational perspective, we're very clear that the difficulties we face in Northern Ireland a quarter of a century on from our agreement is that there was no space taken to reflect upon the illegitimacy of that violence. And the failure to do that means that we are susceptible and at risk of repeating those terrible mistakes of the past. So today we have obviously two local perspectives in Poole and in Anne, two people whom I personally have huge admiration for, but the organisation more so. And they will speak of their own personal journeys, but how they see this issue of accountability not yet being addressed. And we also look forward to hearing from our African brothers in terms of their perspectives around what has and what has not worked in that wider context. So just wish you all an enjoyable and gripping couple of hours, and please do engage with the Q&A session. And these events can only be successful with your involvement. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kenny. And it's now my privilege to introduce our first speaker today, Bishop Anselmo Magaya. I've had the privilege of getting to know Anselmo over the last 3 years, and we've really benefited from just building that relationship and learning more about Zimbabwe and the incredible work that he's involved with. Bishop Magaya is an ordained bishop and founder of Grace Ablaze Ministries International, GAMI. He previously served for more than 10 years as a pastor and overseer of Hatfield Baptist churches. Bishop Magaya is also the founder and executive director of Zimbabwe Divine Destiny, a Christian organisation whose vision is to enable the church to have an audible prophetic voice and visible stature, and through the proclamation and demonstration of the gospel to transform the socio-economic and political landscape of Zimbabwe. He sits on various boards and has been part of a number of initiatives seeking to see Zimbabwe transformed into a modern democracy with godly values. His bold proclamation of a holistic gospel has inspired many. So thank you so much, and I'll hand over to him now.
Thank you very much, Diane. And I'd want to recognize Thrive Islands for having organized this very God-honoring program so that we may share insights regarding the subject matter. As a way of introduction, I'll just give a brief historical overview. In April of 2008, Zimbabwe experienced one of its darkest chapters, wherein the former President Mugabe, through the military, unleashed nationwide violence that resulted in the death of over 200 people, several rape cases, destruction of homes, and internal displacement of thousands. This development was a result of Mugabe's failure to concede electoral defeat he had suffered from the main opposition party. Ladies and gentlemen, I found myself in a situation where, as a church leader, I had to open the doors of the church and our own home to house over 450 victims, some of whom had their limbs broken as a result of the violence. This presented a predicament where, on the one hand, this decision would lead to the closure of the church by the state, as I would have been viewed as siding with opposition party, most of whose members were coming from the rural communities from where they had been displaced, and a deep sense of calling that was compelling me to embrace these victims on the other. In other words, on the one hand, I was quite afraid, I mean, to be honest, that if I was going to take these people I was going to be arrested. I was going to be accused of being a member of this party. But at the same time, deep inside my heart, I knew what to do. Okay? There was also a great possibility of people leaving the church, resulting from fear and stigma. In a country whose politics has become hyper-toxic and polarity is so much entrenched, any action would be viewed through the lenses of political party. As I wondered whether I should take these victims in or not, two portions of scriptures, ladies and gentlemen, were flashed in my mind. And these were quite instructive, forcefully instructive in my mind. These scriptures are Matthew chapter number 25, verses 31 up to 46. You remember the story of the judgment day when God would preside over the judgment and judging people on the basis of what they did to the hungry, to the homeless, to the, to the people that would have been victimized. And also Luke chapter number 10, verse 25, 37, which talks about the Good Samaritan. Both of these scriptures address issues of personal and social responsibilities. It became clear to me, ladies and gentlemen, that upon the Lord's return, he would judge the world on the basis of how people would have responded to the crisis in their nation and communities. I decided thus to take the victims in. This preservation, therefore, is a clarion call to the church, community leaders, and indeed to all people of goodwill to rise beyond fears, to rise beyond biases, detect the needs within the communities and nations so as to act accordingly. I'm going to go now to personal social responsibility, the definition, the way I look at it. Now, very deliberately, I will not give source of this definition because it is an amalgamation of my readings, but as well as my experiences. So I have fused my experiences and my mind, what has gone through my mind regarding this subject matter with what I've actually read. Now, personal and social responsibility, it is an ethic theory in which individuals or organizations are accountable for fulfilling their civic duty, and the action of an individual must benefit another individual, a group of people, a community, and or a whole society. In this way, there must be balance between the national economic growth of any organization, whether church or corporate, or even economic growth of an individual with welfare of individual society and environment around. In other words, there is need here that your resources, your affluence should be reflected as you do personal and social responsibility, should be reflected in the people around you. It is an abominable, as it is loathsome before God for you to live in extravagancy when those around you are wallowing in poverty. Observations from this definition. I'm just gonna share a few observations from the aforesaid definition. Emerging from the foregoing definition, ladies and gentlemen, are the following observations, right? First, personal and social responsibility is measured against individuals and organizations' capacities vis-a-vis the needs around them. I want you to remember the story of that widow recorded in the Gospels, who was rated by the Lord Jesus Christ as having given more than all the rich people who he had given far bigger amounts, but they did so out of their abundance, as opposed to the woman who he had given out of her few resources. Second observation, this responsibility is out of one's volition. It is volitional, it is voluntary, yet one should be accountable. So this is quite a tension, isn't it? on the one hand, nobody's going to arrest you if you do not respond responsibly to the poverty around you, to the displaced around you, to the suffering around you. But I can assure you that the God that we serve, whose throne is in heaven, watches to see how we respond to this. The question is, accountable to who? Now, accountability here is at 3 levels. Accountability to one's conscience, accountability to the society around you, and ultimately accountability to God, our Maker. Remember again, as I've said, Matthew 25, 35 to 47. Right, third observation, personal social responsibility is part of God's social justice agenda. If all, including governments, desist from being greedy, grabbing for ourselves everything, egalitarianism as a concept will become a reality. As long as we have not attained this, we all have an obligation not only to resist injustices, to shake them off, but also to act justly. Fourth observation, whilst the aforementioned definition emphasizes the need for balance between economic growth of an individual, organization, or nation with the growth of other individuals in society, personal and social responsibility goes beyond economic issues to cover psychosocial empowerment of both the victims and perpetrators, wherein with the former, focus would be on helping them to actually access justice. It is very important for justice to happen, to access healing, the wounds. You know, healing of the wounds can only happen when people are given space to tell their painful stories. And this is a universal law, whether in Northern Ireland, Republic of Ireland, Zimbabwe, Cambodia, wherever, for people to really heal, they've got to be given space to declare and to openly speak of their painful past. There is need for forgiveness. You know, you need to work with these people also to be responsible enough to forgive and to allow themselves to for integration. Whilst with the latter, their focus would be on transformative work, because these are former, culprits. They're the ones that have caused mayhem. There's need for them to also be transformed. There is need for them to learn reconciliation with the victim and integration. I'll go straight to blockages. Blockages, they are blockages to personal social responsibilities. Blockage number 1 is the fear of men and stigma associated with some of the social responsibilities. I told you my experiences. There was some fear in me, but Proverbs chapter number 28, verse 1 was an encouragement. The Bible says, wicked people run when they are not pursued, but the bold ones in fact, the righteous ones are as bold as a lion. So there is this very close association between righteousness and boldness. My question, therefore, to you is, can you be righteous at the same time be coward? And this is for your reflection. Reason number 2, failing to see beyond self. Being able to, just being able to see beyond self, it will help you to respond responsibly. So number 3 inhibition, or number 3 reason, self-righteousness, where you see your success, your safety and security as a result of your own doing, whilst the misery, vulnerable, and the downtroddenness of others as a result of their failure, recklessness, or laziness. And you see this victim, you say, it is their own carelessness. What I've experienced here at home is that, people are blamed. For people will blame them. Our system, it is reckless, it is so brutal. So why do you get yourself in danger? And we have instances where churches have chased the people away from their own churches simply because they were in danger with the ruling elite. So I'm saying that you want to blame people for their pain, blaming them and attributing their pain to their recklessness. And so this is an escapist approach. Reason number 4, greed, condescending attitude, and serving unrighteous mammon. You remember that story of Lazarus and the rich man. I'll now quickly go on to the quotations from renowned leaders who were active in social responsibility. I will quote number 1, Martin Luther King Jr., who is also my source of inspiration. King Jr. Luther, who lived in the mid-60s, says, any religion that professes to be concerned about the souls of men and not concerned about the slums that damn them, the economic conditions that strangle them, and the social conditions that cripple them, is a spiritually moribund religion awaiting burial. In other words, that religion does not recognize intent, care, unit, and is awaiting burial. Get out of that religion and embrace the Christ-centered life. Number 2, Mahatma Gandhi says, we have to be the change that we want to see. So you can see universal truths from people that are across religions. This guy was not necessarily a Christian, but he says something very, very fundamental. Number 3, Mother Teresa, a Catholic, says love is not patronizing and charity isn't about pity. It is about love. Let me, as I draw to a conclusion, just talk about principles that we derive from these quotations. Central to these statements are the following principles. Number 1, true religion, as Apostle James posits, is being responsive to the social needs of the people around you. Chapter number 1, verse number 27. And then Isaiah lashes at religion that does not result in setting free the oppressed. That is chapter number 58, verse 6 to 8. Then principle number 2, our vision for change should manifest in our behavior. This is clearly encapsulated by Mahatma Gandhi's statement. We must be the change that we want. And then number 3, love is a sacrificial decision. And thus in expressing it, we should go beyond feelings. In other words, love is a decision. It is not sentimental necessarily. It is not emotional necessarily. It goes beyond the emotion. It is a decision such that even if you don't feel like loving, even if you don't feel like responding to the social needs of the people, you've got to discipline yourself and do it. Then principle number 4, true charity liberates. It is not patronizing. Having said all this, what is my conclusion? I want to submit to this conference that personal and social responsibility is an unalterable divine obligation, and scriptures from Genesis to Revelations. Scriptures are replete with this truth. May the Lord bless you, and may God cause us to embrace his social justice agenda. I thank you.
Sorry, Derek, you're on mute. You need to unmute yourself.
Yes, hello everyone. My name is Derek Poole. I'm facilitating today's conference, and thank you very much, Bishop, for that contribution. I think some people may have lost parts of that contribution, and Thrive Ireland will do their best to send out a copy to all those attending the conference today. So hopefully the bits that you missed, there will be a chance to hear those again. I'm going to introduce our second speaker in a moment, but just before I do that, just to say to the conference delegates that you can start thinking about questions. After all four contributors today have finished, we'll be opening up the forum to questions and answers, and you might want to be thinking about those in advance, or as you're listening, a question might come to mind from one of the speakers, and you might want to note that. Can I just say two things? The first thing is we're going to try and stay on the theme of social and personal responsibility. So in your questions, if you can focus in on that, and any pertinent issues that you've heard the speakers talk about around that theme. And the second thing about the question and answer time is if you can keep your questions very succinct, that makes a really big difference. I know for some of us, the temptation is to write a small sermon, and we want to try and avoid that. So if you can ask a very clean and clear and specific question, that would be helpful. And also, don't be offended if you feel that your specific question didn't get asked. Sometimes we just have too many, but also what we try to do is amalgamate some of the questions so that so that we can cover a little bit more ground. So hopefully that's helpful, and you can start sending questions through any time from now up to the question and answer session. So it's my pleasure to introduce the next speaker, Dr. Alan Humbu, who is the Chief Executive Director Officer of the Way of Peace, a Christian organization involved in peace and reconciliation in Kenya. He has vast amount of experience in community training and in facilitating the theme of healing and reconciliation in post-conflict situations. He himself has been a victim of the Kenyan 2007-2008 post-election violence, which many of us, of course, remember only too well. And that violence, of course, claimed many thousands of lives and caused a massive disruption to society and displacement of people. Alan is also a church worker with the Anglican Church and has served in a very interesting project as a veterinary doctor himself, looking at the conditions and the life and the challenges of an Indigenous community in Kenya called the Rural Cattle Keepers. So Alan, you're very welcome. We're delighted that you're with us, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you, Derek, and the entire conference. I want to start where you mentioned about I being a veterinary doctor. That is my training, my profession. But it's in most cases, listening to Bishop Magaya's presentation, it is almost pretty obvious that people will always wait for a crisis to swing into action, or rather to look at things in a different perspective. And that is also my case, because I was serving as a veterinary doctor among the rural pastoralists in Kenya, the Maasai. Those who may have had a chance to be in Kenya, Maasai is a well-known community. And it well. I was just fresh from college when we had the national election, 2008. Kenya has been a peaceful country for ages and has been in the East African region and Africa at large, hosted many refugees. It has been known as an island of peace. But 2008, all along since 1992, when the country lived under single party democracy, and then 1992 we had an introduction of multipartyism, that is after agitation by civil societies and churches. That one started a series of problems, inter-ethnic confrontation. But all along that was like water boiling, actually heating and not boiling. It's not cooling, it's not boiling, it's there, just bubbling. And it's almost, you see, like when you want to sneeze, and it's almost coming out, and then it goes back. And then when you think it's back, it comes again. But when you try to sneeze out so that you may have relief, it goes back. So since 1992, that has been the situation. But 2008, the hell broke, and we had this war. And out of that war, that is how Way of Peace was formed, and we started as firefighters, reaching communities. First of all, we experienced healing ourselves, because this was anyone who was not, everyone was affected in one way or the other, either losing loved ones or property. And so some facilitators came from Rwanda, and we were facilitated through, and I got healing. And among us, the team that we were with, we felt, no, this is too good to confine it to ourselves. And so we started taking this out to churches, to institutions. We would go into deep places, the displaced camps, and we would facilitate the same process to ensure that people receive the healing that we had received. And many years of that work, we've gathered many lessons. But some slides I would ask maybe Catherine to run through. Maybe the first slide, Catherine. When I think of the subject matter of this day, social and personal responsibility, or rather personal and social responsibility, I cannot miss these two gentlemen. The first gentleman on the left, this is a pastor, and the one on the right is a community elder, quite respectable. These two people lived a very cordial relationship before 2008. But when the war, maybe you run the next slide. One of the community lived on one side of this valley where the arrow is. Actually, the valley there's a river that runs in between there. And the other community lived on the other side. It's a farming community. What you see not clearly, it's a corn. Now, before the war, they used to share the river that is portrayed by the arrow. And every time it was free, women will go down the valley and fetch water and come back. They will take their animals to the water and come back. But after the war, the man on the right had tried shooting arrows to the man on the left, the one on a white turban. Many, I think there were 3, but they were all missing. So when the war subsided, the Cold War persisted, and any community warriors would protect the women going to the river. And then when they left, the other community would also bring in their women. So it also almost became an unwritten rule that this is our time to fetch water during the day, and then the other one. But the two gentlemen, now the point of personal responsibility, something was burning within them, but no one wanted to reach to the other. But at one time, they came, one of them saw the other one coming, because from the top of the hills there, they would see the movement on the other side. He saw one of the other coming. And so he went hiding on trees and reached and called his name and told him, how are you? How shall we live for, how long shall we live in this similar situation? So they agreed. Everyone had a wish, but there was no way to communicate it. So they agreed that each side will bring in, Catherine, next slide. Each side brought some elders. Next slide, please. Each side brought some elders, and these were the elders that started chatting away for peace. They started talking to each other, remembering the good times they had, remembering the cost of what they are doing to each other, because they used even to exchange labor. They worked on each other's farm. And so the next slide, from the two people, you see that was a committee of elders, and then now this is a larger community now coming to discuss over the same issue. To cut the long story short, the two people, out of a concern for their community, they brought in reconciliation to a divided community. Now, for my last slide, Catherine, this is some social model, and at 3 we have the communities and grassroots organization. Then in the middle, that is more of middle tier or middle range leadership, that is churches, academic institutions, and then at 1, these top national leadership, military, political leadership. And what we have experienced in most cases, at 1, Roman 1, where we have top national leadership, that is where people look for solutions. Yet, the main problem is always the people who suffer the most are at Roman 3. But now, when problems are created at Roman 1, through policy, through all sort of legislation, then the problem is felt at 3. It is almost absurd to expect that the same people who create problem at 1 will bring the solution. And this is where now we bring in the whole issue of personal responsibility, whereby what is burning within you, that which is burning within you, that is what you need to do. Because the first step you make will guide you to the next step. And through this, then at Roman 3, where the problem is felt the most, then it is possible to bring out the solution as well. We need the level 2, we need level 1, but if it has not started from level 3, then it is very difficult to really agitate for change that is required to solve the problems of level 3. And many people at 2 do not understand the problem at level 3. And so, because here you have national leaders where their children are born there, they have lived there, they have married there. They understand nothing about the problems at level 1. If we all can take the first step, we can surely take the second. In my community, they say the most difficult work is the work that has not yet started. But any work that has started, for sure, you learn as you go along. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alan, for that. I'm just going to move on now to one of our Indigenous contributors today, Paul Toombs. You're very welcome, Paul. Paul Toombs is married to Valerie and lives outside the small village of Mount Norris in County Armagh. He's the eldest of a family of 5 who grew up in the seaside town of Warren Point, which we will all know well. That's in County Down. His father, Ivan, was a senior customs and excise officer and a part-time major in the British Army. His dad survived a murder attempt on his life in August 1976, although he was seriously wounded. And he continued to work in Warren Point as a customs and excise officer. Unfortunately, he was targeted again and murdered by the Provisional IRA on the 16th of January, 1981, in his place of work, which was at Warren Point Docks. Paul, you're very welcome, and we look forward to hearing your thoughts on today's theme of social and personal responsibility.
Well, can I firstly thank you, Derek, for your warm words of welcome, for me to come here and tell part of my story and part of my journey. The first slide, please, Catherine. If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and I will forgive their sin and I will heal their land. God shows us in this text the model for personal and collective responsibility. I suppose part of growing up is about taking responsibility for oneself. We start off as infants with no personal responsibility whatsoever. As we progress through the various stages of childhood, and as we grow in knowledge and understanding, we begin to take on more and more responsibility. We learn that responsibility has its rewards and irresponsibility has its consequences. In many ways, the difference between a child and an adult is the willingness to take on personal responsibility for his or her actions. I want to tell you briefly about my own personal experience, the difficulties that followed, and the responsibilities that were thrust on my life at an early age. On the 16th of January, 1981, at 11 a.m. on a wet Friday morning, my world and that of my family was changed unexpectedly when my father encountered 2 terrorist members of the Provisional IRA who brutally shot him in cold blood in his office in Warren Point Customs Station.
Ivan Toombs' children were at school when they heard the news.
I can remember exactly where I was at school that day. It was lunchtime. I was in the playground. One of my friends came to me and said, "Paul, your father's been shot." you have to make your way to the principal's office. As I made my way to the principal's office, I was met in the corridor by the vice principal, who just held me and hugged me the whole way to the office. There to meet us was my grandfather, my brother, and my other two sisters. We had another sister at home who was only 3 years of age. You see, the reason why my grandfather was there was because my mother was seriously ill in hospital at the time. As we started the journey home, it seemed to take for ages. But I was afraid to ask whether Dad was alive or dead, for he had already previously been shot. It wasn't until we arrived at our house that the blinds were drawn that I realized that my father was dead. My grandmother was there along with a green French from the UDR. And we waited in our house until our minister arrived. We then went to the hospital to inform Mum that Dad was dead. I was then, later on that day, asked to go and identify my dad's body. I can still see those bullet wounds in his face as he lay there in the mortuary of Daisy Hill Hospital. Something that has haunted me for some time. At the wake, many people came to visit us and comfort us as well they could. And many people shook hands with me and said, "Paul, you're now the family of the house. You have to look after your mum and the rest of the family." Being told you're the man of the family carries with it responsibility. A responsibility I was not ready for. A responsibility that thrust upon me. It was many years later in my life that those heavy weights of responsibility that I was carrying became too much. You see, the burden of responsibility that I was dealing with, and also the burden of loss, and the burden of grief and pain, the burden of fear, and I have to sort of say, the burden of bitterness. In those days, there was no counselling. You licked your own wounds, you might say, and you got on with living life the best that you possibly could. For when those who are responsible for the murder of your loved one are not brought to justice or before the courts to bear the burdens for their crimes, who then carries that burden? Is it society? So guess who it is? When people feel let down by their government, by their politicians, the authorities, and even the church, they lose trust, they lose faith, and sadly and unfortunately, some even lose hope. As I thought over the subject of responsibility in the context of Northern Ireland and possibly other conflicts, I thought of a stool with 3 legs. Each of the stool is represented. Personal responsibility, public responsibility, and paramilitary responsibility. My personal responsibility took on the role of caring for my mother, brother, and 3 sisters after the murder of my father. When I married Valerie and we had 3 children came along, my main focus and responsibility turned to raising our children to the best of our ability. Valerie and I worked hard to provide a good home, education, and a safe environment for them to grow up in. This did not mean I let go of my responsibility to my mum and the rest of the family, but primarily my main focus was on Valerie and the kids, and now our 4 grandchildren. I also have a responsibility as a Christian to share the good news of the gospel, of what God has done for me in my life, how he now carries my burdens, my pain, my fears, hurt, and my bitterness. In Matthew's Gospel, chapter 11, Jesus says, "Come unto me, all you who are weary and are burdened, and I will give you rest." See, part of my responsibility is to tell others about God, a God who cares for them, who loves them, a God who will not forsake them, no matter what. For we live in a world of fake news, fake friends, and I have to say, in many ways, a fake peace process. God has a plan for each and every one of us, a plan to give us hope and a future. And God wants to carry your burdens. But firstly, we must realize our sinfulness, be truly sorry, repent, believing in Jesus, the resurrection and the life eternal. Then and only then can we be reconciled to God through his grace and mercy. My responsibility is to do what is right and proper in this fallen world and leave the consequences to God. Public responsibility. And I have to sort of say the state and the church responsibility means that they must show good leadership. Anyone who holds position in public office, be it in government, politicians, legal, police, doctors, nurses, church leaders, clergy, holders in leadership set examples for good, decent, moral behaviour, not only in public, but in their private lives too, thus setting an example for society as a whole. They must be selfless in their duties, having integrity, honesty, openness, and to be held accountable. When we hear leading political figures say they haven't gone away, you know, or the IRA's campaign was justified, and that there was a chance they too would have taken up arms during the Troubles. This is so wrong, from whatever quarter it comes from. It sends out the wrong signals to younger people and society as a whole. The church must give leadership and say publicly that which was wrong, not sit in silence while families are being re-traumatized. Isaiah 1:17 says this: "Learn to do right, seek justice, encourage the oppressed, defend the causes of the fatherless, and plead the case of the widow." Paramilitary organizations, they too have a responsibility. For over 25 years, sadly, they inflicted pain, grief, and hurt, and they have to take responsibility for their actions. Because 3 days after my dad was murdered, the South Down Brigade of the Provisional IRA claimed responsibility for that. When a person picks up a weapon, be it a knife, be it a gun, bomb, and their intention is to cause harm or destruction, that person is responsible for his or her actions, as is the organization in which that individual belongs to and represents. There is no reason whatsoever in taking the life of another human being, no cause or injustice even, that one might feel here in Northern Ireland or in anywhere else. The two gunmen who drove up on a stolen motorbike walked into my dad's office and shot him made a choice. They made a choice to stand over him and pump several rounds into his body to make sure he was dead. Their plan was to kill and murder not only my dad, but another member of staff who was a part-time police officer. Fortunately for him, he was checking one of the container boats on the docks that particular time. My choices and that of my family and so many have been taken away from us from the barrel of a gun or the exploding of a bomb. Our futures were changed forever. Those individuals and organizations have a responsibility and a duty to say that what they did was wrong. Have true regret, repent. They might not understand the term repent, but they certainly know what is right and wrong. And also to offer some type of restitution, not only to those families who they have inflicted the pain on, but on society as a whole. They must take responsibility of what they have done in the past, but they also have a responsibility in shaping our future, as do we all.
The warning call came too late. Across the road, in a jeweller's shop, was an 11-year-old schoolboy, Alan McCrum.
He was at his music lesson and I usually took him home. And he's waiting for his lift. And he came into the shop and was sitting in the chair. And I was taking this jewellery out of the jeweller's window and putting it away. And then he got up and he came towards me and he says, "Is that the last one?" I says, "Yes." And after this I says, "I can go down and go home." And just that was the bang. And the jewellery I had in my hand just scattered on the floor, and when I came back up into the shop, the wee boy was just lying on the floor. There's a piece of metal from my car, just seemed to hit him in the back of the head.
Both Alan McCrum and I were at school. Did Alan McCrum have a choice? Was he able to grow and take on responsibility? You know, if one of those legs of that stool falls short, then the stool becomes unstable, rocky, and may even fall. We must all come and sit on the stool of repentance. Jeremiah says, "They dress the wounds of my people as though it were not serious. Peace, peace, they say, when there is no peace." For many, like myself, the present has become as traumatic as the past. Thank you. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Paul, for that contribution. We're just going to move on now to our final speaker, Anne Travers. Anne was born in Belfast in 1969, just before the Troubles began. She was the youngest of 6 children. Her parents, Tom and Joan, our parents, Paul and Joan, or Tom and Joan, came from a modest family background and had a strong faith. On the 8th of April, 1984, while walking home from Mass, Anne's parents, and sister, aged 23 at the time, came under attack from 2 IRA gunmen. A 4-year-old Anne came out to the sound of gunfire and with her 3 brothers witnessed the immediate aftermath. In 2011, Anne lobbied for a law to prevent those with a serious criminal conviction being given the opportunity to act as special advisors at political levels, unless they first showed remorse to the families and helped them to get closure from the atrocities. After one member of the murder gang was appointed as a special advisor to Sinn Féin, Sinn Féin's cultural minister, in 2013, Anne lobbied for what became known as Anne's Law. And that came into legislation which helped people deal with the issues of the past and not be aggravated by the fact that post-conflict situations where active terrorists were given political and senior posts in political parties. We're delighted to have you with us. Thank you for being here, and we look forward to hearing your contribution.
Thanks very much, Derek. I'm really not sure how I can just follow on from Paul's contribution there, but I shall. First of all, I'd like to thank Thrive for inviting me to speak here today, and I'd like to thank all of you who have tuned in to take part in this webinar. I would just like to share today a little bit of my own life experience, which has drawn me to the importance of acknowledgement of victims and the social and personal responsibility of all of us, so that what happened during the Troubles never, ever, ever happens again. So I'd like to ask you just to watch a very short media clip of around the time of my sister's funeral in 1984.
Judge this organization and its leaders and its representatives by what they say now about Mary Travers' death. Remember her. If people who refuse to condemn her murder come and ask you later to vote for her.
We were a very close family. As Derek has said, there were 6 children. I had 5 other siblings, 4 boys, 2 girls. Mary was the second eldest. We benefit from wonderful parents, Tom and Joan. My dad and mum both grew up in very modest. In fact, Dad would have grown up in a very poor household in Strangford in County Down, and my mother was from Ballyshannon in County Donegal. My dad, at the age of 14, left school when his own father passed away at the age of 52 to help take care of his mother, who wasn't well at the time, and to take care of the household. So he started off the job as an office boy and in Downpatrick, and then eventually at the age of 18 he moved to Belfast with his mum and one of his sisters. Also, they rented a house, ironically, in Windsor Avenue, where we ended up growing up and where Mary ended up losing her life. Dad started doing night classes, and actually it was at one of these night classes that he met my mum, and he eventually qualified as a solicitor at the age of 30 when mum and him had just got married. Mum was a very senior theatre nurse in the Mater Hospital, And on the birth of their eldest child, my brother Tom, she gave up her job to look after her family, as was very common back in those days. You know, we were brought up to be very mindful of others, to respect others. We would say our daily rosary. It was usually at the weekend. And I, being the youngest, used to try to get out of having to say any of the decade of the rosary because I couldn't remember it all, and used to hide behind the settee. We went to Mass every Sunday. Sometimes my parents would encourage us that if we could, even just to call into the chapel during the week at any point in the week to say a little prayer, that we should. And they certainly tried to go to daily Mass. So God was very present in our lives growing up, and still would be today. Can I have the next slide, please, Catherine? Mary was my big sister. Here she is playing with me at the, I don't know how old I was there as a little toddler. I think you can probably see my nappy maybe hanging down under that dress. I don't know. But she was the one who got us all going, playing the games, whether it was playing teacher with us, or dressing my brothers up in dresses and wigs, and the fun that we would have. Mum and Dad tried to protect all of us from the horror that was going on around us at that time. So Mary was a natural teacher. She was also a musician. She played the concert harp and she played the piano. She could play it just by ear. She was tiny. She was just under 5'4". And weighed probably just under 7 stone. So playing this massive concert harp was very heavy on her, but she was incredible. She was just amazing. It was absolutely no surprise whenever Mary graduated in July 1983 with an education degree, first class honours degree, and started her first teaching job in September of that year in a primary school over in West Belfast. So only 9 months later, when Mary was 23 years of age, she was walking home from Mass with Mum and Dad whenever they were attacked by the Provisional IRA. And the first that I knew about it was when my brother Paul came into my bedroom. I was 14 years of age and I was listening to BBC Radio 1, listening to music, and I'd just had my lunch. And he told me to go down to the tennis courts, which was only a couple of 100 yards away from our home, to go and help Mary, Mum and Dad, because they had all been shot. And I was confused. I didn't know what he meant. And he shouted at me again to get up and get going. So I ran out of our house. Paul went in to use our emergency radio that we had at the time. It was only a bit of security that we had. Dad, became a registered magistrate in 1980. So he'd only been working the job for 4 years. And I was joined then by one of my brothers, Martin, as I reached the scene of seeing Mary lying on top of my mum, and Mum groaning, and Dad was just lying a little bit away from them, trying to undo his shirt collar and his cuffs. The next slide, actually, Catherine, sorry. This was being actually what Mary and Mum and Dad, this is how they looked the day that they were attacked. This is only 9 months on from that graduation. Somebody lifted Mary off my mum and placed her kind of awkwardly towards my dad's feet. And I looked up to her, looked over towards her and thought that she was kind of gurgling. But I would imagine that she was already dead. She had been shot once in the back. Mum got down her hands and knees beside my dad and cried, my poor husband, somebody please help my poor husband. Other people started to arrive on the scene and it became quite a confusion. I was put into the back of an unmarked police car where Greenfinch tried to keep me safe. She could see that I was traumatised but I didn't want to sit in this car and did my best to get out. And eventually I managed to get out of it, and there was an ambulance there, and Mary had been put into the back of the ambulance. My brother Paul was sitting there with a lady who had just been passing by, but she was helping out, and she was a off-duty nurse, and she was trying to clean Mary up, and Paul said, "But she'll be okay, won't she?" And this nurse shook her head. So I got out of the ambulance and I went back to our home, where for some reason I lifted the phone and rang my best friend at the time, who was only 15 years of age. And I wheeled down the phone to her that Mum and Dad had been shot and that Mary was dead and that Dad was very seriously injured. She told me at that time that I had to take responsibility to be there for Mum, that Mum would need me. And I hung up. We said goodbye. It was a terrible time. We didn't know whether or not Dad was going to die as well. We had to delay Mary's funeral. As you saw on that piece of footage, I was walking down the aisle with my mum, sobbing constantly. It was just like, couldn't imagine what had just happened to us from this lovely, happy life that we had, where we wished no evil or harm on anybody, to have it visited on us that day. In that day, there was a woman arrested not far from the scene. Her name was Marianne Mcardle, and she had taken the guns from the two gunmen and their wigs that they had been wearing and stuffed them down her surgical stockings. And she was arrested while she walked along the Malone Road in Belfast, walking what was apparently a stolen dog, and charged with the attempted murder of my father and the murder of my parents and the murder of my sister Mary. It was only after Dad came out from hospital that really the true story of what happened that day was told to us. And Dad told us that they were walking home very happy when they heard a gunshot, and they stopped, and the previous year a friend of my father's had been shot outside the same church, Judge William Doyle, and he thought that somebody else had been shot and he was going to trip up the gunmen as they ran past. But as he turned around, he saw one gunman with wearing, well, he said just had a crazy look on his face and waving a gun out from under a pile of newspapers. And Dad asked him, "What do you want?" And he said, "It's you that we want." Simultaneously, Mary said, "Daddy, that man has a gun." But she was talking about a separate gunman. And that separate gunman shot Mary once in the back. She fell on top of Mum, knocking her down onto the ground. He then walked over to them both. And as Mary lay down on top of Mum, he put the gun to my mother's forehead and pulled the trigger twice, but the bullets jammed. Meanwhile, the other gunman shot Dad 6 times at point-blank range as he lay on the ground. We then later on found out that a friend of my sister's, and I use the word friend very loosely, he used to wait for her to come off the bus, he'd walk her home from Mass, he was forever chatting to her. He had actually given the IRA gang our family's movements, and in fact had hidden the 2 gunmen in his flat immediately afterwards. Some years later, when I was driving down the Malone Road and I'd learned how to drive, my mum was in the passenger seat and I saw this man walking across the road and I sped the car up. I was going to knock him down, but I braked suddenly and stopped, and he looked into the car. I couldn't have killed him. I couldn't have had that in my conscience. And my mum just looked straight ahead and placed her hand on my knee and said, "Well done, Anne. You don't want to end up as bad as them." And we drove on, and we never spoke of the incident ever again. As a consequence of my dad being shot and having to wait for a court case to come up, he had to go into witness protection along with my mum. So they were sent over to England and I was sent to boarding school. At that time then, I developed an eating disorder where I would starve myself, then purge, then make myself sick. It was the only way that I could have control in my life when everything else was so out of control. Eventually the court case came up. Mary Mcardle was found guilty. Her family cheered and she waved and smiled at her family as she was led away down into the cells. One of the other gunmen had also been charged, but he was acquitted due to the identification process. So life went on then for us. We managed as best we could. I got married, I had 5 children. And then in May 2011, I received a phone call from a BBC researcher to let me know that Mary Mcardle had been appointed as a special advisor to the Sinn Féin Culture Minister, Carol Nicullen. Mary Mcardle was in prison with Carol Nicullen, and in fact, she was so well thought of with the IRA women prisoners that she was made OC, or Officer in Command. So all I could say was that Mary Mcardle was being rewarded for her part in my sister's murder and the attempted murder of my parents. When I was told that she'd received this position, it was like being punched in the stomach. I cannot tell you the trauma that I relived in those few minutes that I heard her name being mentioned after not hearing it being mentioned for years. I ended up having to lobby, doing media interviews, something which I had never done before. We were a very private family. We didn't really speak out about what had happened to us. I had a miscarriage in June of 2011. I can only put down to stress and pressure of all of it. I had to give evidence up in Stormont. My social media accounts, I was being trolled. I would get messages at all times of the day and night calling me various names, wishing that I was dead. It was just horrendous. I ended up developing breast cancer in July 2012, but still kept going because I knew that if I didn't speak out for my sister Mary and for other victims, that we would never have a chance our voices would never be heard. And yes, Catherine, sorry, I forgot to say move on to that next slide. So I asked on numerous occasions for Mary Mcardle to speak with me and she refused to. The historical investigations team who did reports on murders here in Northern Ireland wrote to her and asked her to speak with them and she refused to. So the Special Advisors Bill, when it came in, isn't to stop people from working as special advisors, but just purely asking that those with a serious criminal conviction of over 5 years, that they show remorse towards those that they committed the hurt to. And if that means them talking to them or by helping them to achieve justice or some form of answers, something that the family is satisfied with, then so be it. It is taking accountability and responsibility for their actions. But otherwise, victims in Northern Ireland are always being asked to be the ones to always give. To give, give, give. Meanwhile, as Paul previously said, we have got politicians who justify the murder continually today of people during the Troubles, including the attempted murder of my father. So here I am, a 51-year-old woman. Can you move on to the next slide, please, Catherine? And with my work with victims over the past number of years, I have become so aware of the importance of acknowledgement. There must not be any other sisters like Mary murdered, lives lost, no more husbands, no more mothers, fathers, mothers, sisters, uncles, brothers. We all deserve acknowledgement. And for that, I believe that we need to share our life experiences. We need to get into schools. We need to share it with our young people, because what happened here in Northern Ireland can never, ever, ever happen again. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. We appreciate that. And we know that was recalling and recording all that again. It must have been difficult, but we appreciate your openness and honesty. We're going to move into a question and answer time. We have a number of questions here to consider. Our time is reasonably short, so we'll try and do our best. And the first question actually comes on the back of Anne's contribution, which simply says, is there an obligation for society to create spaces where stories like the stories we are hearing today can be heard? I'm going to ask for a quick response from our two African delegates on that. So the question is it a responsibility of society to create spaces where the stories of victims can be heard? And as briefly as you can, in your context, what does that look like? Would you like to pick that up, Alan?
Sorry, Derek, I didn't get the question well.
Sorry, you didn't hear the question?
Yeah, maybe understanding it.
Oh, okay. The question is a simple one. It's does society have a responsibility to facilitate a space in which victims of violence can tell their story? And if so, how do you do that in your context?
Good. Yeah, I think that's a model society which probably doesn't exist, whereby the society provides the space for the victims to express their opinion, their suffering, their pain, because again, it's the same society that is the perpetrator. So in most cases, the society is divided. There are those fighting for that space, and there are those that are limiting that space. And so it all calls for strategy, and sometimes most effective non-violence approach to really demanding and regaining that space, because it will never be given in a handshake. It will always be demanded. Yeah.
Anselmo, have you any thoughts in your context?
For that question, I think like what Alan is saying, it's difficult, but what we have found working in Zimbabwe, and this has been happening, and this we hope continues to happen, that like-minded people who appreciate the fact that wrong is wrong, there is no spin doctor that can ever change or shift the form of wrongness and make it right. So they actually create that space where people would come to tell their stories. And because this has been the church, we pray with them, and where they are able to identify and to state who they are, the perpetrators are, we try to reach out to the perpetrators to facilitate, justice morally, where they would have to ask for forgiveness if they are able to, and then reconciliation between the two happens. But this as I've said, happens outside the conventional means, outside the formal state facilitated process. But this is the, society's, my answer really would say, yes, it is possible with the difficulties. And finally, why difficulties? In our case, you will still have to be accountable to the state and be arrested for organizing such. And this is the battle that has been happening between us and the state here.
Great. Thank you. Paula, I'll go to you just on the back of what we've heard from the African experience there. I'm not quite sure what the right word is, but a kind of recognition that that the expectation that society is going to be able to fully give the kind of understanding and recognition and even confession that we would hope for. The recognition that that is the model society, and we're not likely to get that. Paul, in the light of that experience, how do you see the situation in Northern Ireland in terms of stories being told with the kind of vulnerability and courage and openness that we've heard today, but there is not a reciprocation from the perpetrators to those stories. In the light of that, Paul, what do we do?
I think we need to look at what we want society to be for our future. And our future must be built on those things that are good, proper, and right. And we can't sort of, we need to look for support in terms of politicians. We need to look support from our churches. I think, victimhood is very much an individual experience. There's not two victims the exact same. And by the very fact that we have victims groups in existence in society at the minute, it shows the failure to address their needs. And I think it's vitally important that that story is told to people how Anne and the likes of myself have got on, have been, tried to make life as best as possible for our children. We didn't go out and make the excuse because of the murder of our loved one to go out and take revenge for that there. So, when people sort of say they've done this for a cause or whatever, it was never justified that violence came about or death or destruction came to this province or anywhere else.
Great, thanks, Paul. And a similar question to you, if you've any thoughts.
Yeah, I think, Derek, it's very important that all stories are told and heard, no matter from whom. But I think they need to be told in such a way that they are factual, that they are just of the events, and allow then our young people to use their own critical thinking about how they view it and what they can learn from it. Because our ultimate goal has to be that nobody else will ever lose their life again through terrorism. And, only was coming up now to my lovely friend Leanne McKee's 2nd anniversary, and she was murdered in April 2019 by the so-called New IRA. And unfortunately, these Republican and loyalist groups are still recruiting our young people. So unless we can get into their classrooms and into their colleges and just show them the reality, the consequences of violence, then we really stand no hope. Because unfortunately, in this country, history does tend to repeat itself. And we must do everything that we can to stop that, especially whenever politicians in this country still justify the murders during the Troubles.
Yeah.
There's a question here, and I'll stay with yourself maybe, and then move to Paul. There's a question here that hasn't the Good Friday Agreement dealt with all of this?
Quite simply, the answer is no. The Good Friday Agreement did not consider victims in one little iota. You know, victims. Well,
could you tease that out a little bit? Say a bit more about that, because not everyone will necessarily know what victims have been left with. And indeed, I would suggest that most of our society are quite indifferent to the past because they think the Good Friday Agreement was a settlement for the future.
Unfortunately, if they were to read through the Good Friday Agreement, they would see that there was nothing there for victims. Victims had to accept their loved ones' murders, being released early from prison without showing any remorse. They saw the celebrations as they left prison. Victims have always had to give everything. And I suppose in a personal aspect, it came to my door when I received that phone call in May 2011 about Marianne Mcardle being appointed special advisor, because there was my Mary dead, my elderly mother expected still to pay towards Marianne Mcardle's very wealthy salary of up to £90,000 sterling. And victims weren't entitled to have a voice, because as soon as we speak up, we're called bitter. We're told we're living in the past. We're told that things have moved on. And yet people don't seem to understand that what we live with today is because of what happened to us in the past. But I don't know one single solitary victim who doesn't want a happy and safe and prosperous future for our children and for our society. So no, in simple terms, the Good Friday Agreement fell very short with regard to victims.
Paul?
Yeah, I would very much agree with Anne on that. You know, there's responsibility and then there's accountability. And I feel for many victims, accountability was taken away from them when the prisoners were released as part of the Good Friday Agreement. That accountability has been lost over the lack of forensic evidence, for instance, which was destroyed before being forensically tested. I think the length of time since the crime was committed and the lack of willpower on the part of the authorities to seek convictions. And the people seem more interested in an appeasement process whereby those responsible for death and destruction here, where comfort letters have been handed out. The definition of a victim, which equates a perpetrator as an equal to an innocent victim. Some groups are handed thousands of pounds organisation to be an old boys club. And I refer back to the speech, they haven't gone away, you know. The ongoing saga of victims' pensions. Victims have never been asked or looked upon. And even more recently, there's been secret talks facilitated by the church at Lambert Palace, supposedly about a blanket amnesty. Where were the victims there? Are the victims representative at any of these talks? They were never consulted from the start, and they still are being not consulted on anything about our future.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. Just following on from that, there's a question here. Do we have a responsibility to accept the inadequacy of the post-conflict settlement for the sake of the future and our children? Anselmo, has things been settled in your situation? And if not, is there a sense that you might need to accept a limited outcome for the sake of the future?
This has always been a debate, even among scholars, whether people should sacrifice justice for the sake of peace, or whether they should be able to really say, yeah, let's have justice. And then those that know that justice means prosecution will resist that. So really, it is very important that these two ideals should not be exclusive from each other. Yes, in Zimbabwe, we have had some settlement that have actually become the sort of a breeding foundation for more conflict. In 1983 up to 1987, there was conflict in the southern region of Zimbabwe, where we lost over 20,000 civilians. And in December of 1987, there was a unit accord that was signed between two political leaders. And we have noted this to be quite cosmetic and piecemeal. That temporarily stopped the conflict, but became explosive later on. So yeah, it is very difficult. I think in as much as we really want to see peace, we need to continue to fight for justice, as it were.
And Alan, you're in your context, this dilemma between doing justice to the past and the opportunity for a different future. What's the attitude and practice on the ground with you?
Well, I think there is probably two forms of settlement, two levels of settlement, in my opinion. And this is the grassroots and the political. The political one is almost impossible because politics is a game of interests. And in most cases, there is no genuine agenda, even when we talk about settlement of conflict. But on the grassroots, that is where we have worked for many years. And this is to help inner healing. Because when people are healed, they find grace to forgive. And that one is almost shedding a burden of a wounding soul. Because if we were to wait for a settlement whereby there is maybe someone saying, I'm sorry, or someone doing restitution, then we are likely to die very bitter people. But if I do what is my responsibility, that is just surrendering my pain to God and allowing healing, so that if there is possibility that the other person will find an awakening call just to also ask for forgiveness, that's okay. But if they do not, the first responsibility is for me to be free, for me to shed off the burden. And that is a model that is something that is good, because with or without political goodwill, that can happen. But as Anne was saying, even when the wound is healing, the political class will always do some things that will always kind of scratch the wound afresh, because receiving healing and then you see someone does an action like that, it is likely to return the freshness of the wound. But the good thing is, if you visited the first doctor and they healed the wound, then when the political class does it again, you also do it again. You visit the same doctor for the healing of the wound.
Paul, this question, this idea that, and it's common currency in many situations, that for the sake of the future, the sake of a new generation, we've heard some African perspectives there. What do you feel and hear when the issues of justice are suspended for the sake of a new generation?
Well, first and foremost, part of the Good Friday Agreement that we spoke about was the releasing of prisoners. And I think, we all understood that was a sacrifice in terms of the victims. And to move forward together. But I don't see that happening at the minute. In fact, it's more divisive, I think, and also the fact that there's a eulogizing over some of the incidents and the murders that have taken place in the province. And I think, we need to look to some of our governing bodies in political society and within the church as well. And I feel that the church has been actually enslaved by government and politicians in this journey we're all taking together. And it must be much more than just a political value to all of this, but to do what is right and fair in the eyes of God, and to represent those who are the weakest in a caring, compassionate way, and giving direction to the lost. And this is about our future and future of living together. And we can't do that under those circumstances. How can we trust? Mary talked about, it was a family friend. In our case, it was a work colleague of my dad's. It was a neighbor, not that far away, who took information and that. So it's hard for us to trust people when they still regurgitate this hate in our communities. And also, just on that there, what I sort of said, I welcome, the fact that the four main churches have taken responsibility by acknowledging that they've got things wrong in the past and recognize the suffering of many.
Could you tease that out a little bit, Paul? Could you say a bit more on that? What did the churches recognize?
The church recognized that they've got things wrong in the past. I don't think, on the ground, I think individual clergymen were very much part of the community and seeing the suffering. But I think from the leadership of the church, I think that wasn't very evident. Yes, there was condemnation, but I don't think, I know for myself locally here, the Glenann UDR base was blown up and there was 3 UDR members were killed in that incident. And they're remembered each year, but it's only the local clergyman at 9 a.m. on a cold morning each year, rain, hail and snow, are there with the people on the ground, seeing the pain. It's very quiet, it's not public, but we never see representatives there alongside us. Yes, they'll come out with speeches like this, like they did, but let's get down onto the ground and see where the real hurt and the real pain is. And just to say on that as well, we've had people tell us to forgive from the church. We've to tell us to move on. And I think that weighs on another burden upon us. As I said, grief and victims is a very personal thing. And just, that's what I'll say, isn't it?
Thank you. And in a similar vein, this idea, and it's a very common idea, that we must accept the restrictions of justice, issues of healing, spaces for dialogue, for people's stories to be heard, that we must be willing to negate those possibilities for the sake of a future. What does that feel like or seem like to you?
I am tired, very, very tired of victims being continually asked to have these matters put on their shoulders. So I can sit and I have been in situations where I've sat and had conversations with people that I normally would not have had a conversation with. And they will say one thing to my face and then walk out of the room and say something completely different. I'm afraid until politicians take that responsibility upon themselves and stop trying to put the responsibility onto the victims, take the responsibility to acknowledge that the murder that happened was wrong. Nobody had a right to take a human life. I know that we cannot turn the clock back, but all that I am asking simply is that they say, in hindsight, if we were to go back in time, we would do things differently. That's all I, as a victim, and I'm asking for them to say. I do not think about the men that murdered my sister and even Marianne Mcardle. I actually couldn't care less about them. When people talk about forgiveness, I can't forgive people who haven't asked me for their forgiveness. I don't think of them that way. I was brought up to not have hate or bitterness in my soul, and it's certainly not what I have, but I am tired. In fact, I would say I am exhausted, and I know many thousands of victims are exhausted with hearing on a daily basis that we must accept all of this because it means then that others don't get murdered. Well, look, 2 years ago, Lyra McKee murdered. It hasn't made a button of difference until those politicians come out and show a good modelling standard to people who have the same beliefs as them, and to say murder is not justified. Democracy is the only way that we shall ever achieve anything. Until they come out and say that, well, then we are going round and round and round and round in the circle. And my only care now is that we speak with our young people in schools and in colleges, and we let them listen to the stories, because our young people are clever and they're like sponges, and they will be able to use their own critical thinking to come to their own conclusions about things. So hopefully they don't get dragged into the same mess that all of us have experienced innocently.
The issue of the role of the church has come up there. Anselmo, could you succinctly say a little bit about the church initiatives in your context, what they were, and what their value possibly was?
Well, yeah, it's a bit difficult because the church is quite broad. There is, on the one hand, the section of the church that is also very cautious, section of the church that is state captured and coerced, and therefore will emphasize this, what I would call a very unhealthy position that Ain is really decrying on, the fact that people should just forgive. But there is also a section of the church, which certainly I belong to, which believes that true reconciliation can only be attained on the basis of Psalm 85, verse 10, and mercy have met together. Truth and mercy, when, truth means, speaks to issues of speaking out and talking about the past and all truth being told. Only then can people be merciful enough and be able to forgive. And when that happens, justice ensues. And then after justice, there's going to be peace. So this, in my very honest opinion, is the only way that will result in permanent peace. Otherwise, outside that, we will continue to have repeated cycles of violence, because it looks like this is the principle that God has, namely that we've got to deal with it. We've got to ask for forgiveness. There's going to be public acknowledgement, after which repentance happens and people vow that this should never happen again. And I'm sure what I'm hearing from Ende, this is quite universal, clearest evidence of how these things are quite universal wherever you are.
Alan, a similar question to yourself, succinctly, if you can, the role of the church in your context.
Well, definitely when I remember when the church was quite vibrant in my country, when I started, I talked about the clamor for multipartism, that is 19 years preceding to 1992. That was purely a fight of the church, aided by civil societies as well. And that is one gain that the church can stand out even today to really boost about. But when Bishop talks about state-captured churches, then here it is even more complicated, because state-captured, but also there are also those captured by their own greed and clamor for materialism, and so truth is swallowed in between there. You know, justice is not something that is very friendly, and will always lead you into loggerhead with the political elite. And churches have been known to just be corrupted into singing the tune of the government and the political class. So the section of the church that has remained as light is small. But one thing I know, light, however small, it will always shine away darkness. And the whole issue of discipleship. Today, when you talk about churches in my country, you will talk about million denominations. And so each denomination has its own belief. Some of them are always going to heaven. From Monday to the next Monday, they are on their way to heaven. So things of justice and peace, things of this world do not concern them. It's about going to heaven. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Paul and Anne, I'm going to give you the final word here today. And again, brief if you can. In the light of this issue of the role of the church, it's a church-based organization facilitating today's conversation. Could you say what value or not this has been to you? Paul, would you like to go first?
Yes, it's allowed me to think about responsibility and my own personal responsibility as a Christian, as I sort of say, to give out that message of the gospel. And, you know, I've read a book some time ago by Bishop John Rusciano from Rwanda. And in his book, he said about finding forgiveness. It's entitled Finding Forgiveness Amidst a Pile of Bones. When he said when we talk about reconciliation in Rwanda, we are not just talking about reconciliation between Hutu and Tutsi, rival ethnic groups. He said we, the religious leaders in the country, must reconcile ourselves with society at large. God will hold us accountable if we don't repent and change our attitudes in the same way. The government must reconcile with the people they serve to do their best for everyone and not playing favorites or giving into corruption. And, you know, God expects Christians to forgive one another in the same way that he forgave us. And the Bible teaches us that God's forgiveness is a commitment by the one true God to pardon graciously those who repent and believe. So they are reconciled to him and will be glorified. I think this serves, Derek, as a blueprint of how we as Christians live our lives. And it's on that there, as I sort of said, it was by giving my life over to the Lord that those burdens were lifted from me. And I know you spoke extensively on forgiveness, and I don't want to go into forgiveness, but that's, and I think the church has a big role in that there. You know, we have what have we done in Northern Ireland in terms, we've got the highest mental health, we you know what I mean, problems there. And I think spiritually, the church can help in a big way to society, as all the other mental well-beings that are out there in society as well.
Thank you. Anne, you've the final word here, just on what you think today has been for you, and maybe a comment on the role of the church, a brief one.
I think actually I've attended all 3 events, and I find them fascinating. I really would like to thank our friends in Africa, for, I'm learning all the time about other parts of the world and how you have dealt with things. As regards the church, personally, I feel very let down, by the church. I feel that they need to speak out more in support for victims now. They seem to be very quiet and very silent at times whenever victims have been re-traumatized. They don't actually go onto the media and speak out for fear that they may upset certain people. So I do feel very, very, very disappointed. I know that I just live my life in that Christian way that my parents taught me. And that's how I teach my own children, and just live it as best as I possibly can. But thank you very much for having me here today.
Thank you.
Thank you for that poignant ending. And just before I hand over to Diane to bring closure to today's conference, just some comments have come through from delegates, basically wanting to thank everyone for their contribution today, and in particular, I want to thank Paul and Anne for their storytelling and the vulnerability and openness of their contribution. So thank you for that. We've run out of time, so Diane, over to you.
Yes, I want to also say thank you, and thank you for just the vulnerability of your stories, and for enabling us just to have more insight. I think I had a conversation with Kenny that really tried to express that there are many people who maybe they lived through the Troubles, but they didn't suffer directly. And, sometimes they're afraid to engage in these sorts of conversations. And I think that that's part of the issue. And really, we wanted to create the space to enable some of this to happen, but not just from a Northern Ireland perspective. So we wanted to bring in the African voices. So thank you again to all of our speakers. Thanks for all those who attended today. And a number of you have joined us for the whole series. So don't forget that all of them are being recorded. And if you know of people who would really appreciate hearing them, then they're on the Thrive Ireland website, and they're on YouTube. We would also be really grateful if you would take the time to fill in the evaluation that's going to be sent out to you following the webinar by ND Events, because that's really going to help us in shaping future events. And also really just for our feedback to the churches. I want to thank Kenny Donaldson, who I'm going to invite to say a few words as well. And I want to thank the other SEFF members, as well as Norman Hamilton from Contemporary Christianity, for partnering with us to make this series possible. And of course, I can't not thank the Community Relations Council, who provided the funding. And thanks again to the speakers. Alan, I hope, will be traveling to Northern Ireland later this year to speak at another event or two, and I'm sure he would be very interested in visiting some of you if you're interested in him joining you. So please join our mailing list if you want to find out more. And I want to thank ND Events, Catherine and Neil, who have really made our lives a lot easier by managing the technology. Otherwise, I would have definitely been a lot more traumatized. So anyway, Kenny, over to you.
Thank you, Dan. I'll second the technology issue, because those who know me best will know that it's not my forte either. So no, all those folks that work behind the scenes who pulled this program together, it didn't happen magically, and we are indebted to them. But also have to say to the speakers down throughout the last 3 sessions, both in terms of our African brothers and sisters, but also locally. I think there was a real integrity in how people shared their story and their perspectives. We had a diverse range of speakers as well, which I think was important, and to have a full discussion around all these issues. But I suppose something that I take away from the 3 sessions is that there's a great deal of benefit to be had in opening up discussions with others whom have not experienced entirely comparable, but certainly very difficult situations within their own homelands, and how we can learn and support one another through all of that. The other thing I would caution as well is our churches, when we speak of the terminology of we perhaps need to do something else in order to ensure that society has a better future, always be conscious that actually what the we is the victims. Victims have been the collateral damage for a quarter of a century and have paid the huge sacrifices that have been made. Wider society hasn't had to pay those sacrifices, but wider society has gained some benefit on the back of those sacrifices. So if we're going to put anything else at the door of people as we move forward, then please listen to what victims and survivors are saying around the circumstances where that could be palatable. And what is required is accountability, is an acknowledgement across the board of the wrong of violence. That's the way, as Anne rightly says, her friend Lara McKee does not need to have others following on her back in terms of having been murdered. And there's a real risk and a danger of that being the case. So we do need to, I think, redouble our efforts around all of that. But I want to thank you, Diane, for all your work on this, and to Derek, and to Alan, and to Bishop and Kelmo today. And we do hope that there will be opportunities for further engagements down the line. Thank you, one and all.
Yes, thanks very much. And there will indeed be follow-up.